The room had no name. It appeared on no lease, no deed, no document of any kind that connected it to the men who used it. It was the third floor of a building on Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan, reached through a restaurant kitchen, up a staircase that smelled of garlic and old wood, through a door that looked like a closet from the outside, and opened into a space furnished with a single long table, 8 chairs, and a view of the street below through curtains that were never fully opened. This room was where the most powerful men in American organized crime had been making decisions for 30 years, and in all of that time, not once had a black man sat at that table as anything other than the subject of a decision being made about him. On the night of March 14th, 1935, that changed. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked into that room at 9 in the evening, alone, wearing a suit that cost more than most men in Harlem made in a month, carrying nothing in his hands, and sat down at the center of the long table across from Charles Lucky Luciano, as if he had been doing it his entire life. The 5 men already in the room watched him sit down. None of them spoke for a moment. Then Luciano poured 2 glasses of wine, pushed one across the table, and said 4 words in the particular quiet voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising it. "Tell me your number." What happened in the next 3 hours would reshape the financial architecture of organized crime in New York for the next 2 decades. But to understand what Bumpy Johnson said in response to those 4 words, you need to understand how a man from Charleston, South Carolina, had arrived at a table in Lower Manhattan that no one had ever invited him to, and had done it without once asking for permission. The numbers racket in Harlem in 1935 was not a simple operation. It was, in scale and sophistication, one of the most profitable financial enterprises in New York City, generating somewhere between $20 and $40 million annually in a neighborhood whose residents were systematically locked out of every legitimate financial institution in the city. Players chose 3-digit numbers, paid a penny or a nickel or a dollar on their selection, and collected if their number matched the last 3 digits of the day's total handle at a designated racetrack. The odds were 999 to 1, the payout typically 600 to 1, and the margin in between was what built empires. Bumpy Johnson had not created this system. It had existed in Harlem for decades before him, managed most significantly by a West Indian immigrant named Stephanie St. Clair, who had built the most organized and most through a combination of intelligence and ruthlessness that earned her the name Madame Queen, maintained it against considerable opposition for years. Bumpy had come to work for Stephanie St. Clair in the late 1920s, and what he brought to her organization was not physical force, though he was capable of it, but something considerably more valuable in a business that depended on trust at every level. He brought the ability to read people, to understand their motivations before they fully understood them themselves, and to construct situations in which the outcome he wanted appeared, to everyone involved, to be the outcome they had chosen freely. These skills had made him indispensable to Stephanie St. Clair. They had also made him visible in ways that attracted attention from directions that no one in Harlem's numbers operations had fully anticipated. Harlem's numbers operation for years, with the particular interest of men who understand profit and are accustomed, eventually, to claiming it. Dutch Schultz had been the first to make a serious move, muscling his way into Harlem's numbers by the early 1930s, through a combination of violence and corruption so systematic that it had restructured the entire operation within 18 months, turning independent operators into de facto employees of an organization they had never agreed to join. Stephanie St. Clair had fought Dutch Schultz with every weapon she had, including information delivered to law enforcement at precisely the moment it would do Schultz the most damage. During those years of war, she had increasingly relied on Bumpy Johnson to manage the street-level dimensions of a conflict that had cost lives, money, and organizational stability. Dutch Schultz was murdered in October of 1935, shot at the Palace Chop House in Newark by gunmen operating on orders from the National Crime Syndicate. Men who had decided that Schultz's erratic behavior and his announced intention to assassinate Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey had made him a liability that could not be managed any other way. His death created a vacuum in Harlem's numbers operation that every significant figure in New York's organized crime understood would need to be filled quickly, before the chaos of unclaimed territory produced a war that would cost everyone money. Lucky Luciano understood this more clearly than anyone. As the architect of the National Crime Syndicate and the man most responsible for the organizational structure that governed how the Italian families operated in New York, Luciano understood that Harlem's numbers operation was not simply a revenue stream. It was a proof of concept. If the syndicate could absorb and manage a financial operation of that scale and that complexity in a neighborhood where its traditional methods of control did not apply. But Luciano also understood something that most of his colleagues did not want to acknowledge, which was that Dutch Schultz's approach to Harlem had failed on its own terms. Schultz had taken control through violence and held it through fear, because fear is an excellent short-term management tool and a disastrous long-term one. People who are afraid make mistakes. People who are terrorized find ways to root their business elsewhere. And Harlem's residents, who had spent generations developing an expertise in the particular art of operating under oppressive systems without surrendering the systems themselves, had found more ways to keep their money away from Dutch Schultz than Schultz had ever been able to anticipate. Luciano had studied these results with the attention of a man who intends to do better. Dutch Schultz's approach had failed because fear is an excellent short-term management tool and a disastrous long-term one. In 3 years of Schultz's control, Harlem's numbers operation had lost approximately a third of its players to informal alternatives, neighborhood lotteries, underground networks invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. The conclusion Luciano had reached by the winter of 1935 was that the only way to manage Harlem's numbers operation profitably was to work with the man who actually understood how it functioned, which meant working with Bumpy Johnson, which meant doing something that no one in the syndicate's leadership had ever done before. It meant negotiating. The first approach came not from Luciano directly, but through an intermediary, a Sicilian-born capo named Salvatore Maranzano, who had legitimate business connections in Harlem and had, over the years, developed the kind of relationships there that most of his colleagues lacked. Maranzano reached out to a man named Eddie Watkins, who was known to both organizations as someone who operated in the space between them, and Eddie Watkins carried the message to Bumpy Johnson on a Thursday afternoon in February. The message was simple. Lucky Luciano wanted a meeting. Bumpy sat with that message for 3 days before he responded, not because he was uncertain about whether to go, but because he understood that how he responded would communicate something important about what kind of meeting this was going to be. A man who answered immediately was a man who had been waiting for the call. A man who took 3 days was a man with other things to consider. On the 3rd day, he sent his response through Eddie Watkins. He would meet. He had one condition. The meeting would be on neutral ground, not in Little Italy, not in Harlem, but somewhere that belonged to neither world. He suggested a restaurant on the west side that was owned by a Greek immigrant who served both communities without allegiance to either, and who could be relied upon, for reasons Bumpy had established over several years of careful relationship building, to maintain absolute discretion about the conversations conducted in his private dining room. Luciano agreed to the condition without negotiation, which was itself a communication. A man who accepts your terms before discussing them is a man who needs the meeting more than you do. They met for the first time at that restaurant on a Tuesday evening. No bodyguards in the room, though both men had people outside. Bumpy arrived first and was already seated when Luciano came through the door. That Bumpy Johnson was not going to spend this meeting performing deference to a man who had requested it. Luciano noticed this. His expression, as he took the seat across from Bumpy, suggested that he found it interesting rather than offensive, which told Bumpy something important about the man he was dealing with. A man who is offended by being made to wait is a man whose ego is more important to him than his business. Luciano was not that man. They ate before they talked, which was Luciano's preference and which Bumpy had anticipated, because he had spent 3 weeks learning everything he could about Charles Lucky Luciano's habits, preferences, and methods of operation. The food was good. The conversation during the meal was general, the kind of conversation that men conduct when they are establishing the register, in which they will subsequently talk about the things that actually matter. By the end of the meal, both men had understood something essential about the other, and the conversation that followed had a quality of directness that neither man had expected to achieve this quickly. Luciano spoke first. He said that Dutch Schultz's approach to Harlem had been destructive, and that the syndicate recognized this and did not intend to repeat it. He said that the numbers operation in Harlem was worth considerably more than it had produced under Schultz's management, and that this discrepancy represented an opportunity. He said that he was interested in an arrangement that would restore the operation to its former profitability, while establishing a structure that the syndicate could rely on for stability. Then he stopped speaking and looked at Bumpy Johnson and waited. Bumpy understood that he was being offered a moment to name terms, and that how he named them would determine whether this conversation produced anything useful. He had 3 options. He could negotiate from a position of apparent weakness, asking for less than he knew the operation was worth and hoping to build from there. He could overclaim, demanding a share so large that Luciano would be forced to push back and the real negotiation would begin from that counter. Or he could do what he had decided 3 weeks ago, when he first received word of this meeting, that he was going to do. He could tell the truth. The truth was this: the numbers operation in Harlem could not be managed by the syndicate, not because the syndicate lacked the resources or the organizational capacity, but because it lacked something that no outside organization could simply acquire. It was a business of choice. People played because they wanted to play, because it was entertainment and hope and a form of communal participation. People who paid out on time, people who were seen at church on Sunday and helped families through hard times, and were part of the fabric of a community that had learned, across generations, to be very careful about where it placed its trust. Dutch Schultz had not understood this. He had understood only that there was money moving through Harlem and that men with guns could redirect money. He was not wrong about the guns. He was wrong about the money, because the money moved through systems of trust that guns could intimidate but could not replace. And when the trust was damaged, the money found other channels. In the 3 years of Schultz's control, Bumpy had watched Harlem's numbers operation lose approximately 1/3 of its players to informal alternatives, neighborhood lotteries, policy operations run out of churches, underground networks that the syndicate never found because they were invisible to anyone who didn't already know where to look. He explained all of this to Lucky Luciano over 2 hours, precisely, without embellishment, in the particular voice of a man who is not making an argument but describing a reality. Luciano listened without interrupting, which was a quality Bumpy had not expected to find in him, and which raised his assessment of the man considerably. When Bumpy finished, Luciano asked one question. He asked what Bumpy thought the operation could produce annually under proper management. Bumpy told him a number. It was larger than what Schultz had been taking. It was also, demonstrably, based on actual receipts from the years before Schultz's takeover, accurate. Luciano was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that was the real question, the one the entire evening had been moving toward. And what would proper management look like? Bumpy had his answer ready, because he had known this question was coming, and he had spent 3 weeks preparing for it with the same thoroughness he brought to everything that mattered. Proper management looked like this. The syndicate would receive a percentage of the operation's net revenue. In exchange, the syndicate would provide what it provided to its own operations: protection from law enforcement interference, resolution of disputes with other organizations that might attempt to move in, creating records that attracted federal attention. What the syndicate would not do was manage the operation directly. It would not place its own men in leadership positions. It would not restructure the network of runners, collectors, and bankers that Bumpy had spent years building, and that was, in every practical sense, the operation itself. And it would not interfere with the relationship between the operation and its players, which meant no increases in the house advantage, no delayed payouts, no changes to any of the terms that the community had come to rely on. Then he said that what Bumpy was describing was not an acquisition, it was a partnership. Bumpy agreed that it was. Luciano said that the syndicate did not do partnerships with independent operators. Bumpy said he understood that, and that was why what was being proposed would require the syndicate to make a decision it had never made before. Another silence. Luciano poured more wine for both of them. This was, Bumpy understood, a thinking gesture rather than a social one. He waited. "What makes you believe," Luciano said finally, "that I would agree to terms that give you operational control of an enterprise on which my organization depends for revenue?" "Because," Bumpy said, "you've already tried the alternative, and it cost you 30% of the revenue base in 3 years, which you can't, not in any time frame that makes financial sense, and not without producing the kind of conflict that attracts law enforcement attention that is bad for every business you're running, not just this one." He paused, then added the part that he had saved for this moment specifically, because he had understood that the argument had to arrive in the right order for its weight to be fully felt. "And because I've already been approached by 2 other organizations who are very interested in providing the institutional support that would allow Harlem's numbers operation to continue functioning without any involvement from the Luciano family at all." The temperature in the room changed. Not dramatically. Luciano was too controlled a man for dramatic reactions, but Bumpy saw what he was looking for, which was a very slight adjustment in the set of the other man's shoulders. A recalibration, the physical expression of a mind that has just received new information and is integrating it. The 2 other organizations were not named, because naming them would have required Bumpy to be specific about conversations that had been exploratory and preliminary rather than substantive. But the implication was sufficient, because Luciano understood better than anyone the geography of organized crime in New York in 1935. And he understood which organizations had the capacity and the motivation to move into the space that Dutch Schultz's death had opened. And he understood that a man as well positioned as Bumpy Johnson would naturally have been approached by more than one of them. What followed was not an immediate agreement. That would have been too fast. And both men knew that a decision made too quickly in a room like this was a decision that hadn't been fully considered and would create problems later. Luciano said he would need to discuss the terms with his partners. Bumpy said he understood, and that he would be available for a second conversation when Luciano was ready. They shook hands at the door of the restaurant, which was the first time that evening that physical contact had been part of the interaction, and which carried, in that context, the particular weight of a gesture that both men understood to be meaningful without either of them saying so. The second conversation happened 10 days later. It was at the room on Mulberry Street, and there were 5 men on Luciano's side of the table. Not one, which Bumpy had anticipated because he understood that the decision being made was not Luciano's alone to make. He arrived alone, as he had to the first meeting, and sat in the center of the table's long side, equidistant from both ends, which positioned him as neither a guest nor a supplicant, but as a participant in a discussion, whose outcome he had an equal stake in. The 5 men across from him were Luciano, his underboss, Frank Costello, a Genovese family capo named Vito Morelli, who controlled much of the syndicate's financial operations, a quiet lawyer named Anthony Ferraro, who was there to ensure that whatever was agreed to could be structured in ways that minimized legal exposure, and a 5th man who was introduced simply as a representative of the Chicago interests, whose presence indicated that the conversation had significance beyond New York, and whose silence throughout the evening was the most eloquent communication in the room. Costello spoke first, which told Bumpy that Luciano had delegated the early portion of the negotiation deliberately, perhaps to allow himself the position of final authority on whatever questions remained unresolved after Costello had made his points. Costello was a smoother man than Luciano in some ways, more social, with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent his career building relationships rather than simply commanding them. He began by acknowledging that the terms Bumpy had proposed at the first meeting were creative, and that the organization had discussed them seriously. Bumpy waited for the but. The but was this: the percentage Bumpy had proposed was too low. The syndicate's position was that operational control of the kind Bumpy was describing, control that remained entirely in Bumpy's hands, justified a significantly larger share of the revenue than what had been named at the first meeting. Bumpy had expected this, because it was the obvious opening counter, and he had prepared his response with care. He did not argue the percentage directly. Instead, he placed on the table a document that his financial associate, Marcus Thompson, had prepared over the preceding week, which contained a detailed financial history of Harlem's numbers operation across the preceding decade, showing revenue figures before Schultz's takeover, during Schultz's control, and projections for recovery under different management structures. The document was 22 pages long. Bumpy gave the 5 men time to look at it, because he understood that the most persuasive arguments are the ones that people arrive at themselves after being given the necessary information. He poured himself water and waited while Morelli, who was clearly the financial mind in the room, worked through the projections on pages 16 through 19 with the focused attention of a man who is checking someone else's arithmetic and finding that it holds. When Morelli looked up from the document, his expression was the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he found mildly inconvenient to confirm. Given the operational structure being proposed, Costello looked at Morelli, looked at Luciano, looked back at the document. What Bumpy had shown them was that the percentage he had proposed, applied to the revenue projections based on restored trust operations, would produce more absolute revenue for the syndicate than a higher percentage of the diminished base that any alternative structure would generate. The argument was not that his terms were generous. It was that his terms were more profitable than the alternative terms would be. He was not asking them to accept less. He was showing them how to make more. The Chicago representative spoke for the first time. He asked a single question, directed at Bumpy rather than at any of the men on his own side of the table. He asked what Bumpy's personal guarantee was worth if the projections didn't materialize. Bumpy looked at him directly, which was the appropriate response to a direct question. "My guarantee," he said, "is my name and everything attached to it. If the numbers don't materialize within 18 months, I will renegotiate at whatever percentage this table considers appropriate, with no conditions. If they do materialize, I expect the same courtesy in return, that the terms we agree to tonight hold without renegotiation for a minimum of 5 years." The room was quiet for a moment. The Chicago representative nodded once, then looked at Luciano and said nothing further. The remaining 2 hours were the details, accounting procedures, payment schedules, the specific mechanism for resolving disputes, the question of what happened if law enforcement targeted the operation, and whether Bumpy would receive the same legal support the syndicate extended to its own members. On this last question, Bumpy was precise. He was not asking for the same support, because the mechanisms available to protect a black operator in Harlem from law enforcement were not the same mechanisms that protected Italian operators in Lower Manhattan, and Bumpy wanted the syndicate's institutional weight applied through whatever channels were actually effective, rather than through channels that worked in other neighborhoods but not in his. Costello found this distinction interesting enough to repeat it to Luciano, as if Bumpy were not in the room. Luciano said he found it reasonable. By midnight, the terms had been agreed to, and Ferraro had made notes that he would convert into an informal memorandum of understanding. Not the kind of document that could be submitted in court, but the kind that both sides would keep and refer to when memories of precise terms diverged, which they always eventually did. Luciano walked Bumpy to the door of the building himself, which was a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the other men, because walking a departing guest to the door was something Luciano did for very few people, and the men in that room had spent years calibrating their understanding of which gestures Luciano used to communicate which things. At the door, Luciano asked one more question. He asked, not in the manner of a negotiation, but in the manner of genuine curiosity, how Bumpy had arrived at the projections in the document. Not the arithmetic, but the assumption about the rate of trust restoration. How did he know the players would come back? Bumpy thought about how to answer this accurately. Then he said that the players hadn't left because they wanted to. They had left because they had no choice under Schultz. And people who leave because they have no choice come back as soon as choice is restored. Because the thing they left was something they valued, and the absence of it is something they feel. Give people back what they chose to lose, and they return at a rate that reflects how much they wanted it in the first place. Luciano was quiet for a moment. Then he said that this was an interesting way of understanding a business. Bumpy said that most businesses worked this way if you paid attention to the people in them, rather than just the money moving through them. He put on his hat, said good night, and walked out onto Mulberry Street into the March cold, because implementing it required restructuring relationships at every level of Harlem's numbers, operation in ways that communicated to everyone involved that the terms of their situation had changed without changing the people they trusted or the work they did. Bumpy was the one who managed this transition, which meant 100 separate conversations in back rooms and corner booths and kitchen tables across Harlem, explaining to men and women who had spent years operating under threat what the new arrangement meant for them specifically. What it meant, in the simplest terms, was this: they were no longer employees of an organization they hadn't chosen. They were participants in a structure that Bumpy Johnson had negotiated on their behalf, with terms that guaranteed their operational independence, their payment schedules, and their protection from the kind of external interference that had disrupted everything under Dutch Schultz. Nothing in their daily work changed. What changed was the invisible architecture above them, who received the institutional percentages, what protection those percentages bought, and who was accountable when things went wrong. The revenue projections held. Within a year, the numbers operation was generating at the levels Bumpy had shown in the document, and within 2 years it had exceeded them, because the restoration of trust had attracted not just returning players, but new ones, people who had never played before, but whose neighbors and co-workers had come back with stories about payouts that arrived on schedule and disputes that were resolved fairly, and operators who knew their names. The Chicago representative, whose name Bumpy learned through subsequent channels, was a man called Joseph Rivers, sent a brief message through intermediaries approximately 14 months after the Mulberry Street meeting. The message contained no words. It contained a single item, a copy of the projections from Bumpy's 22-page document, with the actual figures for the preceding year written in pencil beside each projection. Every actual figure was higher than the projected one. Bumpy kept that document. He kept it in the same drawer as his mother's photograph and the notebook with 214 names in it. He never showed it to anyone. What the Mulberry Street Agreement produced over the following decade was not simply a profitable business arrangement. It produced something considerably more rare in the landscape of New York's organized crime, which was a precedent. The precedent was not formally acknowledged by anyone involved, because acknowledging it would have required men who had built their identities on certain assumptions about power and hierarchy to publicly revise those assumptions. But the precedent existed in practice, in the fact that for 10 years after that March evening in 1935, Harlem's numbers operation ran under terms that Bumpy Johnson had negotiated at a table where no one had expected him to be, treated as an equal, and the terms held, and the revenue flowed. And no one in the Luciano organization ever had cause to argue that the arrangement had not served their interests precisely as promised. Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, convicted on charges that had accumulated over years of law enforcement attention. Before he left, he had one final conversation with Bumpy Johnson in a restaurant on the East Side. The details were never recorded. What was noted by a journalist who reconstructed the evening from multiple sources years later was that the two men sat for 3 hours, and that when they left, they shook hands on the sidewalk in the way men shake hands when they have done something difficult together and have done it well. Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem that night and sat for a long time at the desk in his apartment, his hat still on, the 22-page document from 11 years earlier in his hand. He had looked at it many times since that night in the Greek restaurant on the West Side, not because he needed to remember what was in it, but because the document itself, its existence, the fact that it had been created and presented and had worked, was a reminder of something that he found useful to be reminded of periodically. The reminder was this: the most powerful room in New York had been persuaded to make a decision it had never made before, not through force, not through fear, not through any of the methods by which rooms like that were typically persuaded. It had been persuaded by 22 pages of accurate arithmetic and a clear explanation of why the numbers meant what they meant. The room had changed because the information in it had changed. And the information had changed because someone had walked in with a briefcase and the patience to wait while 5 men read. This was, Bumpy thought, putting the document back in the drawer and finally removing his hat, the most important thing he knew about power. It was not about who was in the room. It was about who had done the work before arriving at it. The men who controlled rooms like the one on Mulberry Street had not gotten there by being the strongest or the loudest or the most feared, though many of them were all of those things. They had gotten there by being the most prepared, the most patient, and the most willing to understand a situation completely before attempting to change it. The night Bumpy Johnson walked into that room and sat down at the center of that table, the men across from him had expected him to ask for something. What he did instead was offer them something, specifically the thing they most needed and couldn't get anywhere else, a clear and accurate account of their own situation. And in doing so, he had given them no choice but to deal with him as an equal. Because the alternative, refusing to engage with the only person who fully understood the problem they needed solved, was simply too expensive. Some rooms are opened with force, some with connections, some with money. The room on Mulberry Street had been opened with 22 pages of honest arithmetic and the confidence of a man who had done the work, knew the numbers, and was entirely prepared to walk away if the people across the table were not. That was the deal. That was how it was made. And for 10 years, it held exactly as promised, because it had been built on something more durable than fear or loyalty or the threat of violence. It had been built on the only foundation that genuinely holds in any arrangement between men who don't trust each other: mutual self-interest, clearly demonstrated, on paper, in numbers that both sides could check. Lucky Luciano, in the years he spent in Italy after his deportation, was interviewed on several occasions by journalists and law enforcement officials interested in his decades at the center of American organized crime. He spoke about many things with varying degrees of candor. He never spoke about the arrangement with Harlem, and he never, in any recorded conversation, mentioned the name Ellsworth Johnson. But a Sicilian journalist who spent an afternoon with Luciano in 1958 reported that at some point in their conversation, without apparent context, Luciano had said the following: "There are men who walk into a room and take what they want, and there are men who walk into a room and show you why giving it to them is in your own interest. The second kind is rarer and harder to deal with, because you can refuse the first kind and you cannot honestly refuse the second." The journalist asked who he was thinking of. Luciano smiled and said nobody in particular. Then he changed the subject. The drawer in the apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, where the 22-page document lay folded beside a photograph and a notebook, was locked. It was always locked. Bumpy carried the key. When visitors noticed the locked drawer and asked about it, he told them it was where he kept things that had already served their purpose, but that he was not ready to throw away. He was asked once, by a young man he was mentoring in the late 1950s, what the most important thing he had ever learned about doing business was. Bumpy sat with the question before answering. "Before you walk into any room," he said, "know what's in that room better than the people who've been sitting in it their whole lives. Not to impress them, not to threaten them, just so that when you sit down, there's no version of the conversation that you haven't already had in your own mind." The young man asked what you did if the room still wouldn't deal. Bumpy stood and straightened his jacket. "Then you walk out," he said, "and you let them spend the next year understanding what it costs them that you did." He put on his hat and left. The young man remembered what had been said for the rest of his life and told it to others over the following decades. And in this way, the lesson from a room on Mulberry Street that appeared on no document of any kind spread through Harlem the way useful truths always spread quietly, person to person, long after the man who first understood them was no longer there to explain them.